Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Madam Chair, to my colleague ministers, to members of the Parliament who are here tonight, to senior civil servants who are supporting, and to you, the public. This meeting is really a meeting for you, and it's about you. It's about how we spend the money and how we make the choices about where we spend the money. You would be interested to know, in terms of today, a young man. He was at St. David's Primary. He made an appointment to see me. He said, I have one question to ask the Premier. And he came in, and he's learning early, because he came to disarm me and brought me flowers. And then he sat down and took out a sheet of paper. And he said, look, we really need a youth and community center down in St. David's. What are you going to do about it? And I looked at him, and he was earnest, he was articulate, he was soft-spoken and a little bit shy, but still firm. And I went through my spiel, and he looked at me, and I said, let's make a deal. You come and see me in a year, but what is the beauty of what he did, in my view, is that this little one is doing what you're doing, only you are adults. He was coming to tell me how he felt money should be allocated, what he thought the priorities were. And I may not have persuaded him entirely, but he listened. And I kept thinking of a little child shall lead them. Because this is what budgets and open budgets are about. I talked about it and put it in the National Budget Statement last year, and I said it's about getting feedback, getting input, and even having on sending emails to www.openbudget at openbudget@government.bm, because it's to solicit what you think are the priorities. I'd like to think of it really, if I was to talk about another parable, it's like the parable of the 5 loaves and 2 fish, where you're trying to make something out of what seems to be nothing. But what it is, you found a way to spread it and to make able there in the parable to feed the 5,000. But it was looking at where the needs were. So if you had to think about, probably say one word or a couple of words that you're thinking about tonight, it's about following the money, following your money, and looking at our economic toolkit, which is what the budget really is, to see how you want to see the money followed. Each minister is going to have to be much more disciplined than I in terms of sticking to time. But my job is to sort of cover the waterfront and give you some information as context about what open budget means. The bottom line is that we have sluggish international growth. That is limiting our ability to increase our GDP. We've had negative GDP. The simplistic and naive approach could be to say that why don't you just cut costs by reducing staffing? That's a road that leads to nowhere. Why do I say that? Because what we're seeking to do is increase GDP growth. You cut people, and you can easily say you remove 1,000 people and you remove several hundred million from your budget. But at the same time, what happens? They go out of the government door in one way as personnel, and they come in the door in terms of the Ministry of Financial, which deals with financial assistance. And that's where you're seeing clearly with redundancies and people who are losing jobs, there is a greater need to provide financial assistance. That's why it's so critically important that we do what we can to facilitate an enabling environment for job growth. So clearly, as we look at the issue of framing a budget, looking at the decisions about a budget, probably what you would first want to keep in your economic toolkit is how are ministries' funding allocated. Certainly, if I were to go through a list quickly, I'd say the non-ministry departments. That's those ministries that deal with, or departments that deal with sort of the neutral arbiters, like the Ombudsman, the Auditor General, the Office of Government House, things which deal with even the Parliamentary Registrar, those where they don't report to a minister per se, but they're sort of in this neutral category. That gets an allocation of $14.6 million. Cabinet Office and Departments has an allocation of $18.1 million. Justice gets an allocation of $4.2 million. Finance, which deals with your, you see how I'm changing when I'm talking about finance. Before I tell you the big figure, I'm letting you know what we do. We cover the employee overheads and some of the issues in terms of pension and things like that. The sinking fund, that has a $202 million budget. Education, $128 million. Health, $172 million budget. The Minister of Environment, Planning and Infrastructure Strategy has a budget of about $14.2 million. Transport, $76.2 million. Public Works, $55.9 million. Youth, Families and Sports, $62.3 million. National Security, $100 million. Government Estates and Information Services, $33.1 million. Economy, Trade and Industry, $23.6 million. Business Development and Tourism, $40.3 million. Community Development, which has been rolled into ETI, Economy, Trade and Industry, $6.2 million. Now, what is open budgeting? Open budgeting is a strategic and effective budget tool. And the whole idea is to foster greater public engagement and participation in the country's spending decisions. It also provides you with the opportunity to ask whether this is the best way to allocate your dollars. For instance, about a couple of weeks ago on one of the talk shows, Minister Miners, the Minister for Economy, Trade and Industry, was on the talk show and a question was asked, why don't we institute the unemployment insurance? The minister, the question's a good one. The first Minister of Finance under this government, my father, sought to introduce it. He went up and down the country, talked to the unions, talked to the Chamber of Commerce, talked to the employers' organizations, and what was the sticking point was who was to bear the cost. Is it something where you would see that employees would be prepared to see a deduction from their pay packets? And is it a cost that business would bear? And how do you allocate it? There was resistance at that time. Also, we didn't have the situation we have today in terms of the recession. But clearly, the question of who funds always is critical, because there's only one way to deal with revenue, either by user fees or increased taxes. That's the bottom line. It would be nice if it was manna that fell from heaven, but it isn't. So we've got to find a way to decide, where do we think our spending should go? And how do we decide between different policy objectives?